The Russian occupiers are detained and not paid the promised salaries and payments. There are problems with monetary allowances practically all over Russia, the Sever Reali edition writes. The mobilized themselves refuse to talk about this with the media, but their wives and mothers record appeals to Putin himself. A resident of the Vladimir region, for example, sounded the alarm about the fate of her mobilized son only after the payments were stopped.
I began to worry in the month of January. I did not receive payments then, so I began to call the recruitment office, went to the military registration and enlistment office of the Yuryevets and Vladimir regions. They also wondered why there were no payments. I went to Moscow, to the Ministry of Defense, where they were also very surprised that firstly, I am looking for my son, and secondly, that there were no payments.
Since the beginning of March 2023, payments have been delayed or not paid at all in 52 regions of Russia. Moreover, relatives of those mobilized say that the money has already run out not only for uniforms and supplies, but also for food. So, for example, in a telephone conversation intercepted by Ukrainian intelligence, the wife of a Russian serviceman speaks about the poor supply of units.
They are buying up. They were transported and there is no food where they were transported. The servicemen are buying up only at their own expense. He has run out of money. There is none even for food. Mom had just packed a bag with food, you know, wife of a Russian conscript, from a conversation intercepted by Ukrainian military intelligence.
Mobilized Rosgvardia soldiers from Nizhny Novgorod recorded a video message and asked to send them summer clothes, shorts, socks, radio stations and so on, which the Russian Ministry of Defense is obliged to provide them with. We are required field uniforms, Moscower, camouflage coats, Moscower, summer berets, summer underwear, summer socks, trainers, trouser belts, tactical rucksacks, tactical helmets, radio stations, tactical vests. After the announcement of the mobilization, Vladimir Putin approved a list of instructions on issues of providing support to the mobilized and their families. The Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Finance were instructed to establish monetary payments for citizens of Russia caught up to the front line of the war against Ukraine, based on the minimum guaranteed amount of at least 195,000 rubles per calendar month. However, now instead of the promised hundreds of thousands of rubles, there is zero on the cards. The wives of the military of the Russian army are complaining to the publication Sever Reali.
The salary did not come either for January or February. Before that, everything was fine. 195,000 rubles every month on the 12th. I haven't applied anywhere yet. My husband has been at war since September. He is a volunteer. Yelizaveta, wife of a volunteer to the army, city of Volzhsky, Volgograd region, in an interview with Sever Reali.
As the Russian government reported, by March 2023, the federal budget deficit had already exceeded the annual plan. But according to a press attaché of the opposition movement Off to the Woods, non-payments are not connected with the fact that Putin has run out of money for the war, but with a chaos in the Russian military structures.
Никто, я думаю, и не собирался ничего никому платить.
Nobody, I think, was going to pay anything to anyone. It was more like a lure and an advertising campaign. The Russian army, as our experience shows, as those who contact us show, is such a microcredit organization that offers everyone, without exception, an easy and quick income, after which people are actually enslaved to it. Thus contracts are concluded, thus the army is replenished, thus professional army personnel on paper appears in Russia. The military began to realize that they are fighting for free, and their complaints go nowhere, a Russian human rights activist says. And the situation will get even worse. According to the oppositionists in Russia, a new recruitment of those mobilized to participate in the war against Ukraine has already begun. The summons are received by residents of 44 regions of Russia, from Moscow and St. Petersburg to Dagestan and the Yamalo-Nenets Autonomous District. Among the recipients of documents, there are university students who have a deferment from military service.
The unsuccessful attempt to set fire to the military registration and enlistment office in Russia was regarded as an act of terrorism. Oleg Vazhdayev from Krasnodar, detained in September last year, spoke about the tortures by security forces. Testimony about the alleged Ukrainian customers was beaten out of him.
He truthfully told the security forces about the motives for the arson attempt, but this apparently did not suit the police. Then they put a gas mask on him without a hose, so that no screams could be heard. threw him to the floor, rolled up his pants, and got a current plug to his shins, demanding that he confess to receiving funding from Ukraine. Unable to endure the torture, Oleg remembered the parcel waiting for him at the post office, saying that there were $5,000 listed by the customers of the terrorist attack. He was immediately taken to the post office, but there was a cheap pendant in the parcel. Alexei Avanesyan, lawyer, in an interview with Current Time.
Recall that Vazhdayev threw 2 bottles of Molotov cocktails at the building in order to destroy his accounting records and avoid being mobilized. One of the Molotov cocktails did not smash and the second one set fire in front of the building. Meanwhile, the father of 6th grader Masha Moskalyova from the Tula region has already been sentenced to 2 years in prison. Recall that Alexei Moskalyov was accused of repeated discrediting of the Russian army for the anti-war drawing of his daughter.
The case was settled in one day. According to Moskalyov, his page on the social network was repeatedly hacked, and the publications imputed to him were posted by attackers. Moskalyov's daughter, 6th grader Masha, who drew an anti-war drawing at an art lesson, has been kept in a rehabilitation center for minors since the beginning of March. Vladimir Belyenko, lawyer, in an interview with OVD Info.
A criminal case has been opened in Ulan-Ude about the rehabilitation of Nazism against a teenager who shouted "Glory to Ukraine" while standing on a monument to the Red Guards. And in the Moscow region, Ella Znamenskaya, deputy editor-in-chief of the independent weekly Zhukovsky Vesti, Zhukovsky News, was fined 30,000 rubles for the YouTube stream. "Your denunciation is very important for us," discussing the war in Ukraine. Russia's repressive laws are getting tougher, experts say.
Russian authorities intend to tighten control over the population of Russia, since these laws are not only a measure of responsibility, but they are also an instrument of censorship. In this sense, the authorities are trying to prevent the dissemination of information, thereby carrying out repressions against Russians.
A court in the Khabarovsk region sentenced a Jehovah's Witness to 6.5 years in prison for reading the Bible. Jehovah's Witnesses were recognized in Russia as an extremist organization in 2017. It is still unclear why. The security forces do not give rest to Navalny either. According to Navalny himself, the forces put an old friend, a tractor driver who has big problems with hygiene, to him in a punishment cell again.
You see, once again, there was an amazing coincidence. They put me in a punishment cell, and that man immediately commits a successful offense. He smoked in the same place for 2 months, and no one paid attention. But as soon as it was necessary to make the impossible stuffy cell even more stuffy and unbearable, he was also given 15 days for that smoking. The special charm is that for the last 2 months, he has not been given even basic hygiene items. No toothpaste, no toilet paper. Well, you already understood yourself. They transferred him to me, of course having marinated him in the medical unit. Well, you already understood yourself. They transferred him to me, of course having marinated him in the medical unit. They use a person as a cotton swab with bacteria. Alexei Navalny, Russian opposition leader, on Telegram.
The security forces continue to actively monitor the social networks of Russians, so a resident of Kamensk-Uralsky, Sergei Kiselyov, left a comment on the social network under a post with a photo of a banner on the City Hall building, "Guys, we're waiting for you with a victory." Kiselyov wrote that the banner was hanging for showing off. The court fined him 30,000 rubles. After Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the G7 countries, the EU, and Australia froze $300 billion worth of Russian central bank assets. About 200 billion euros are kept in Belgium and 21 billion euros in another unnamed EU country. The anti-war allies agreed on a commitment to share information about the location of all Russian frozen assets with each other.
Russia doesn't stop its barbaric attacks, and again it has struck Ukrainians' critical infrastructure. The reconstruction will be the next huge task, and the longer the war lasts, the higher will be the damage, and it's also clear that Russia must compensate for the enormous losses and damages caused to Ukraine and its people. It has to pay for the cost of rebuilding Ukraine.
According to the World Bank, the cost of restoring and reconstructing Ukraine is currently more than $400 billion, The New York Times writes, the idea of confiscating the frozen Russian assets is finding more and more supporters.
In principle, it is clear-cut. Russia must pay for the reconstruction of Ukraine, but turning that principle into practice is fraught. This must be done in accordance with EU and international law, and there is currently no direct model for this. Ulf Kristersson, Prime Minister of Sweden, Presidency of the EU Council, in an article by the New York Times.
In the meantime, EU member states are looking for legal opportunities to invest Russian assets in something. The European Commission is already exploring the possibility of investing frozen Russian billions with a short maturity and annual return of about 3%, according to a document published by Politico. After that, the income received will be directed to the restoration of Ukraine, but there are certain risks.
Investing in equity would carry higher returns, but a riskier class of assets could generate losses of up to 4 billion euros per year, raising political and financial implications if the EU were to reimburse Russia for losses incurred while investing its assets. In the publication of the American edition of Politico.
Under EU sanctions, if the restrictions are lifted, the owner of the frozen assets should be able to return their capital as well as any income under the contract before they were frozen. At present, the EU does not have complete information on the holding of all the reserves of the Russian Central Bank. Therefore, in the new package of sanctions against Russia, the European Union has included an obligation to report the location of Russian assets on the territory of the EU.
We are really freezing as much of the oligarchs' money as we can find. The question of withdrawing these funds is another thing. Of course, we are looking for legal ways to link this money to crime, and we will prosecute across Europe anyone who tries to circumvent our sanctions. And that will give us more opportunities. Mairead McGuinness, European Commissioner for Financial Services, in an interview with Suspilne.
At the same time, some governments fear that such a move could put any assets around the world at greater risk. Thus, the government of Switzerland stated that the confiscation of private Russian assets from banks would violate the constitution of the country, as well as international agreements. Nevertheless, several allies have already taken steps to seize Russian assets abroad. Last month, a judge in Manhattan, New York, approved the confiscation of more than $5 million from a sanctioned Russian businessman. Estonia also intends to pass a law that will give the government of this country similar powers.